Yay! Extraordinaire. All right, so I assumed that I would have some sort of like a podium, so I'm just gonna.
Oh, what?
Okay, there's a podium. I'm just gonna sit in this chair. So there should be. There it is, a PowerPoint, which is again completely ludicrous and basic because I have no understanding of technological devices or how they're supposed to aid in presentations. So these are merely notes that I'm sharing my notes with you in presentation form. This was a really hard presentation for me to put together, mostly because I wanted to write about like the culmination of my experience as a master studying poetry, and it didn't go the way that I wanted it to. I was going to, talk about the junkyard and how, studying poetry has made me like a tenacious person that I can like, handle the buckets of the world, and that's actually not what happened at all whenever I studied poetry this chunk of time. And I thought about just faking it, and like presenting it that way anyway, and like doing the junkyard dog presentation, like despite the fact that it was complete bullshit. But I've been public teaching for a long time now, and I know that like you can't bullshit your audience that way. Like you will know if it is not genuine. So it's been an extremely difficult thing to put into like a linear form, because I've come to big epiphanous things that I honestly never thought that I would come to in my life. So it's all about, the junkyard. And I inherited a junkyard at the same time that I started my master's degree at Prescott College that same year from my grandfather. And he bought the junkyard in 1991. And you can't really see the pictures of the junkyard very well, but there it is. There's some cows and there's the junk. So there's the South 40 where there's like an actual farm and like irrigation, and then here's junk. And this is what I was given in I was given all these wonderful opportunities at the same time that I began to study poetry as a master. So in coming to some sort of fruition to what it meant to be a poet, it centered around this place, and it centered around my understanding of like delving into all of these idiosyncrasies of life and humanity, and how it seemed to be continually tangibly linked to the junkyard. So my presentation sort of started to center around that, and to look at the place from where I come in a really tiny microcosm, as well as to expand it out just a hair into the surrounding area. And I think I know it really well. I've lived there for a long time now, but to really know something really well, like you have to wallow in it, in all of the horror and all of the beauty. So I came through that and went through some pretty disturbing things as a human and a poet. But now I do. Stephen King talks about how life is really short. Like human life is really short. He's lived in one place, his entire life, of course, like the great pop poet Stephen King. But there are moments like where you can glean some sort of like real philosophical intuition out of Stephen King, and in his book about writing, he talks about this. He talks about how like delving into a place and like really knowing it is something that not a lot of people have an opportunity to do, because life is really short. So you either get to do this like one time or two times maybe in your entire life to really know a place, or you can know lots of places really shallowly, like just like a little bit. So the junkyard, and what I came to find out about the junkyard. Go for it, Preston. All right, so one of the first things that I started to study whenever I moved to the junkyard and began to study poetry was magic realism, and I was like completely overtaken by this notion of magic and how reality and like the wormholes of consciousness were linked through verse. And I started to clean up all the junk and, like work with the animals, and it seemed to me that every time I would like come to some sort of like cathartic moment, the tangible forces of the universe like sort of knew it before me, and while I was like employed in this activity, like that's when it came forward. So lots of magical stuff happened in my first year of on the junkyard, and the first few poems that I chose to share with you were centered around that idea. I did my whole study on magic realism, and some of these are the poems that came out of that. So here we go. This is the first time I've read my poems in like a crowd ever. So I might pee my pants. I'm just warning you right now. Go for it, Justin. Here we go.
We'll get that on.
Yeah, it'll be on tape right here. I'll have to stand right here in case. All right. So this first poem is called Low Company, and it's about thistles. So here we go. Low Company. The Russian thistle is an aggressive species which most farmers want to annihilate. Their frosted thorns mutilate work gloves. Their purple seeds germinate on combative stalks. Once the spade turns up their stiletted stems, you often see the tiny gem abdomens of ants. But then the farmers have no concern. I wish I knew more about these two. how they fulfill each other, and what strange underground kindnesses are smothered by daylight, then my judgment of their faults might be true. So I don't know how to converge upon, talking about my poetry as far as like patterns. For this one, I tried to use really simple verb phrases and enjambments to like pull those out. And again, the stanzas are divided because I wanted to make that like, three really distinct phases of understanding. And there's, there was magic inside of that. There was, so there I am like out there digging thistles with my chemicals, and it's like a continuous war that you wage against these beasts. And there they are, like their sons pop up like the next year, and then like you go to war on them. And there's all of this combativeness inside of it. However, there's another side of this like creature that whenever you like battle it, you come to understand it, and that is magical. And so there you are turning up roots, and there are like whole colonies of beings and like systems of survival that you're not aware that you're destroying, nor do you have any care that you're destroying it whenever you're waged in this war. But you're losing something inside of that, something inside of magic. So again, I tried to use kind of a subtle rhyme scheme to show that that there is subtlety, and if you're missing the subtlety, then you're missing the magic. So that was a little confusing. And I had a picture of a thistle, but it didn't turn out very well. So okay. So this next one is about my grandma, who was married to my grandpa, and she still lives on the junkyard. There are two separate houses on the junkyard, and I live in one, and she lives in the other, and I take care of her out there, and she's getting really, really old now. And this is about, she's a seamstress, and has been a seamstress most of her life, and this is about her button jar, and the magic that I found there when I was a child, and how that came to fruition as an adult. This poem's called Fasteners. My grandmother kept a mason jar filled with buttons. She still does. To the brim it was filled with plastic, glass, tortoise-shell wood, tinkling reflections strewn its walls, and its place near the sill, its clasp, a middle hinge, enclosed the fastening secrets. I would slide my palms through all the shapes, watching the avalanche they created, varying temperatures based on my skin, thread still trailing from my eyes, and the truth and mastery abated. Tipping the jar with my wrists, I heard their jingling cries. Even an ecstasy of curious shapes holds disaster, and the delicate mix is venom too, for a touch of a razor blade with the alabaster used to sever the old buttons and then meld the new, and the joy was too much to resist its youth. The slice from the blade only added to the jar's sooth. So I don't really like the end of this one. It seems like I'm trying to like mold understanding around like that last rhyme, but the whole notion that I was going for here is that no matter how magical things are, there's still like an edge to them, just with the thistles and everything else. And I tried to use the two separate stanzas to do that. Lots of polysyndeton sentences in the first part of the stanza, so that it leads into that, more confined like, banging of the hammer there at the end. And this is actually the style of poetry that I like grew into most comfortably in the last 4 years. Like a nice, like lilting, almost like comforting beginning stanza, and then like a stab in the end. And I realized, it took me a long time to realize this, but that's perhaps not the only way to write a good poem. So the next couple poems show this very same style, this like lilting beginning with polysyndeton, and then like, the verb phrases like sharpening at the end with the heroic couplet to like stab that truth home. And there is magic inside of that, but there's also like extreme pain too. And I figured out the longer that I wrote poetry, perhaps it doesn't actually need to be that way. But for now, again, this is the early stuff on the junkyard. I was very much centered around those ideas and how to look at the world and view the observances of beauty was like sentimental crap. And if you were really going to be a poet, like you had to look at like how the world was like victimized. And so my words came out in that response. And that was my experience with magic realism. So, I'm sorry, Kristen. Yeah, my next exploration came around the notion of that connectedness to place, and how words and verse are connected to place, and how those can be explored in numerous devices, and those techniques came along with many. I mean, this is when I did my series on patterns, this is when I did my series on rhyme, this is when I did my studies on form, so sonnets and villanelles, and all of these poems were written in conjunction with my understanding of place. So, I was like, all about magic and all of these like magical things forcing you to into fruition. And then I left magic and I became more focused on the tangible elements of geography. And so these next poems, I hope, show that insight and the way that I began to like the seeds of change were like started to be planted. And again, I'm only understanding this like in retrospect now. It lasts like maybe 4 or 5 weeks. So it is a little difficult to like pinpoint exactly like what's going on as far as like the linear understanding of these epiphanies. But these next two poems, hopefully they do that. They connect geography with pattern and like those deeper elements of organization at first. Oh, sail barn. That's unfortunate because that's a really fun picture of the sail barn. So across the street from my junkyard, there's the highway, which is old Highway 666. It is now Highway 491. But most people in Montezuma County still refer to it as Highway 666. Clearly, they changed this for obvious reasons. One of the most dangerous highways in the world, too. But anyway, and across from my junkyard, there is a sail barn, and it is a local attraction of. If you really want to go see like the true culture of Montezuma County, like go to the sail barn on Wednesday afternoon. I mean, it's like that's the real deal. And I can see it from the window where I write poems, and I frequent it. I take livestock and go to the auction. And so I wrote the sail barn poem. Here it is, sail barn. Old Highway 666 holds the archaic attraction of a livestock auction every Wednesday, a fantastic distraction from local color-rich loiters on the ear tags of heifers, and mingles with the bristles of sows. The bidding utters its first phrases clearly, like an idiot child showing unwarranted promise. The stockmen circle each other and silently reminisce, straining their ears to catch the auctioneer's fast foot before the best deals fall in the dirt, leaving them to pay $1 more. As a young child, my grandmother used to convey me to the sail barn on off days, wafting still the scent of hay, to see a pair of horned owls who perch high in the eaves, too noisy on sail days, she'd say, as we, afoot, across the thick highway. Watching them perch, I couldn't help recall the lambs beneath the previous sale half price. The hollow hammer slam, all neighboring this native pair, who must feel the wild pains of looking down on what we think of as bargains. So again, yeah, there's a whole thing going on here with the first stanza being the long polysyndeton sentences, so lots of subordinate phrases connected together, and then in the end the pace flips up. One of the few poems that I have dialogue into, I have a really hard time writing dialogue, and it's because never seems like genuine, but because this like actually happened, I just used real words, so whether it seems genuine or not. There is. I tried to use 2 different stanzas to keep like that butcher cleave, like the notions of slaughter are all here, the notions of all of the horror of the meat industry are all here. You can't deny the elements of slavery that are underscoring all of this. And it all goes on with like these two, like this pair of symbolic wise individuals, like the icon of wisdom in Western culture, watching us do it. And yeah, just I tried to use wordplay, the bidding utters, lots of to bring out all of those like animalistic responses and how our animalistic responses are perhaps more bestial than actual animalistic responses. And again, pretty brutal, and they're ending with the heroic couplet, pains and bargains. So the next one begins to show like happiness, just a little bit, right? So there was a moment where I began to see that you don't have to write about only the depths of despair and note the woe of the victim through poetry, that is not what all great poetry expresses, that there is sentiment outside of that. And although I had not come, like that wasn't in like the forefront of my consciousness, you can see that it is starting to develop in this poem. This was probably year 2, at the end of my second year of living in the junkyard, and I put in a wood stove, and it was like an exhausting, tormented affair. Like I had to lay the concrete, and it was like a used stove that I finagled from this other guy's junkyard, and it was a whole thing. So I had the stove in, and it was about this time whenever I wrote this poem. It's called Heat. Newfangled pellets are safer, and furnaces are more efficient. Modern clothes dryers even have accoutrements invented to distribute their warm air. The timbers amputated with the angles of a chop blade. needed more consuming heat with their embers. No blowing exhaust, nor thermostats. Clouds of flame smoke clamor to their door, and one breath causes ashes to scuttle on the floor. In the sweltering summer, the sharpened tools hack the limbs in the branch floor to create a burnal stack. A ceremony is to balance the cut logs, because a haphazard heat will enkindle vermin. Sweat is the serum sacrificed to the demigod who rouses the rabble of the coming winter sting. Smashed helms and torn gloves are part of the rite in preparation of the sting of a juxtaposed summer night. When creating the flames for the first wood's fire, dry bones of kindling must be slivered for tinder, creating the fractures of love lost. The flame in the stove is a cherished ingredient. The blue nucleus glows, its yellow halo is embossed with twigs collecting once the cold is absent. This gives wood stoves a best warmth, for the heat thaws flesh twice, when summer makes a sweat fire, and again, when winter produces the ice. So, again, homage to my grandpa, because every time I would cut wood with my grandpa when we were young, he would always tease me about, how this is why the wood stoves are the best kind of heat, because, they always make you burn twice. You have to get really hot, like chopping all the wood, and then in the winter, it heats you up again. However, there's hope in it somewhere, and I try to use all of the notions of metaphor and the blowing exhaust and the syntax to see myself as like a meditation or almost like a prayer. So like you go in these different phases of a prayer, and in the end, you offer it up to the smoke god. So there's heat, and again, it's getting there. It's heating up as far as hopefulness is concerned. It's no longer the elements of victimization that have been with me since birth. Go. Truth and despair. So even though it came from a moment. There's been a grave amount of despair in my poetry over the years, and to know a place, you have to know its ugliness too. Just like your spouse. If you really know someone, you really know them. You know all of them. You know all of their sins and tiny peccadillos. And these next poems illustrate that. So, as close as I came to the junkyard and to my hometown, it's a wild little town, and living in close proximity, I think it's probably worse with the things that you love when you notice those flaws and faults about them. It strikes you much more to look forward.
Can you tell the group where you live?
I live in Montezuma County in Colorado, in Cortez. It's a tiny little, Cortez?
I know Cortez.
Okay, yeah, so it's a tiny little cow town, extremely impoverished. It's 20 miles away from two different reservations. So I work at the local high school there, and there are no windows in our local high school, and students always tease me. I have a chalkboard behind my desk, and they always tease me about drawing me a window, and over the years they've drawn me several different scenes, but the one that has been most poignant is the scene that would actually be outside of my classroom if it was a window, and it is a dilapidated trailer park. And that was my favorite picture that my students drew me on the chalkboard. So yeah, to truly know that, and to come to terms with that, and from the place from which I come, because I was born there, and this is where I've dedicated my life and studies. Those illustrations are here as well. So the first poem that has to do with that, I think, is twins. So here we go. There's an extremely high rate of twins in Montezuma County. I don't know what's in the water, but if you don't want twins, don't live in Montezuma County. I grew up with twins. I've had a set of twins every year that I've taught in high school. I don't know, and 2 sets of triplets. Weird. It's really weird. Every single year that I've taught at the local high school, there's been a set of twins and 2 sets of triplets.
Oh
yeah, it's very weird, and it's a thing. There's twins, and this happened the second year that I taught at the high school, and this is the hill that this happened on, and it looks much steeper than the actual photo. But anyway, twins. In only 5 years in teaching in my home county, 6 pairs of twins, 2 triplets have sat in my class. This is an unusually high duplicate value for my mind, but the freshman brings new identicals in mass. One set sticks out, an elfin pair with button shirts and glasses. No singular identity existed, only the pronouns us and we, and a slowness in one, which in his speech one could say. They lived on a county road, a few county miles from the rural hospital, where they walked when a hit and run occurred, but quite accidental, the driver didn't stop. He sent one spinning, left the slower one behind, and the help was near. The slower turned out. The driver sped up, guiding his steep grade, while the other brothers stayed, watching his reflection fade. So that's the hill on which this happened. And actually, both the twins and the boy who is now in prison for manslaughter, for vehicular manslaughter, were my students whenever this occurred. It was my first experience with student death. And it was a rough one. And the other twin, the brother who survived, is graduating from my class this year. So to come to some sort of catharsis with this seems almost like prostitute-ish. And I don't know how else to do it as a poet and a philosopher. And I think that's one of the reasons, like, the way we create art is to try to gain some like perspective of like the horror that touches us, but then it's out there, and it's like this representation of despair that you share with others, like for what purpose? And so that's when I started to center around whenever I started to write these poems. Like, what is the real purpose of like writing a poem? Like, what are you showing or reflecting back to the world about yourself or your place? And I wasn't sure how to proceed with that. So I just kept at it for a little while. And the next poem that I produced showed the same level of despair, and anger as well. And so this is called Crawfish Supper, and it has little to do with my hometown other than like the theme of the poem, which is always resonating with people very differently. All the Prescott colleges have different languages. But anyway, Crawfish Supper. On the red mud banks of the Georgia Mill Pond, I saw them once. Barefooted boys straddled over the banks, hauling in baskets, and mucked together in the mob at a ready clank, until yanked open the rusty tanks, exposed by piles of crustaceans, ready for the battle. A clicking agitation filled the air, tightened on metal. There's a trick to dividing the sweet meat from the shell. You snap the creature that stirred some whole, the chunks of meat emerge, so after there's no tending the sound. I'd heard, and indeed it's true, when tipped full into a pot brimming with Zyklon B, that the crawfish shriek, much like colonies before butchery. The hissing pot becomes a Southern Baptist revival. Perhaps all helpless things depend on guilt for survival. So there's that. It's, again, the notion that there needs to be this like really strong heroic couplet continues to like recur in my poetry, and I couldn't get away from it. It was like this, I came to these understandings, and that was how it was expressed, and they were all really dark and like macabre and terrifying, and it wouldn't go away. So there's the Crawfish Supper, which clearly has very little to do with my hometown, Montgomery County, although there is an extremely, let's say, fanatically religious-based group of individuals who live in my home county, who have a maniacal power structure. I mean, there's really no other way to say it. And I was dealing with that whenever this poem was written. I just had first like real experience with patriarchy through the church, and that was coming out here. So I felt, as a person who couldn't stand against that I refused to use guilt as a way to deal with those issues. But it's probably the most effective way to deal with that issue. So didn't win that one. But I did. I won later. So the philosophy worked out in the end. And I think that brings me to that culmination. I was in these depths of despair, and it's really difficult to even talk about this again in a linear term, and to not sound like completely cheesy and like, Mary Poppins-ish either. But for whatever reason, perhaps it's because I had a second baby, perhaps it's because, I turned 30, perhaps it's teaching in a high school for a really long time. I attribute it, however, to my master's study of poetry, and I attribute it to that because, previously, whenever I had written poems, and I've considered myself a poet since, a very young age, I was like inspired, and I would go off and write this poem, right? And normally I was inspired by horror and deviance and all of the darkness of the world. However, whenever I was doing my master's study, I couldn't just be willy-nilly about writing poems. I mean, I had a deadline, I had to come up with poems, and there had to be so many on these certain days. So to like wait around for the dark elements of the world to like come across my path and inspire me into poetry, it wasn't working anymore. So I had to really dig, and I had to look for things to inspire me. And as cheesy as that sounds, it changed my life. So like all things for me, or most things that have been a great epiphanous response, it came to me like crashing down on my head with Shakespeare. I was sitting in my high school class while I was like huge pregnant, reading Hamlet, right? with my seniors, and we read the last poor Uric scene, right, like the iconic scene of Shakespeare, you know, where he talks to the soul and everything. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with Hamlet, but he's kind of a punk, you know. He talks about death and suicide, and idolatry. I mean, he does all of this. I mean, this is exactly what he does. He's very childish in his worship of the darkness of the universe, and keeps it very close to him. And for whatever reason, he moves away from that, and that is what he expresses in the last poor Uric scene, and among many other things. He expresses this notion that to die is something that we all go through and experience, but to live is something that we can all experience together. And that's, I realized it in this moment. You know, like there you are, like reading Shakespeare with, you know, like 18-year-olds, and you're like trying to tell them, right? Like, don't you see what's going on here? And like, it was like a big moment for me, perhaps one of the biggest moments of like literary epiphany in my life. And there I was like reading it in a class, and I was about to turn 30, pregnant, right? Having just finished my master's study, and the junkyard was almost done, right? Like it was almost in a phase of completion, right? It was livable. And then I had the alas poor Uric moment. So trying to make a poem of that was very difficult, but I did. So here it is. This is the alas poor Uric poem. Unlike an appendage, a festering soul rots concealed from sight. Bones had a different way of enduring, bleached white from exposure, their bright flags of splendor, they stake their claim. A sexton might know when osteodecomposition begins. I expected a soul's term of corrosion to be the same as curator of the junkyard. I learned a mistake. I set this edge on fire to burn off years of thorough cultivation, and there was the skeleton of my dead horse in the briar. My initial response was a torrent of desperation. This creature had borne me on her back 1,000 times. After her demise, though not a consequence of it, reality deteriorated my soul, unaccompanied by the horse's bearing consort, slackline. But so rarely is the swamp of the mind burnt to reveal the bodies, to reveal the soul. In the span of time the lime worked its charm, I grew up unhappy. Not because of want, though there was some, nor true harm. The catalyst for my decay wasn't lime or love, but the always reliable struggle of reality. Equally certain, the disaffection induced by those early skirmishes with life's gritty conflicts is as perishable as the first reduced pulp, here exposed on human char. Searching for beginnings without ends in the shape of the skull created the feeling that the moments of solace, which no doubt not faster than flesh, are more potent still than the shortcomings throughout life, aimed at the soul with the intent to kill. So the hardest thing about this poem for me was resisting the couplet, right? And that is, I think, going to be like the hardest thing in life for me, is resisting that urge to find the arrow that is like aimed to kill us. And you know, story doesn't need to be that way, and humanity doesn't need to be that way. It is not a series of conflicts or harmonies. It is a balance of prognosis, and it's never stationary. So I tried to use all of the poetic elements of my master's degree to do that, to come full circle in this, instead of having it a linear, almost sonnet-like, which has been ideally masculine, with this like aimed spear in the end, like, you know, wound with this like truth. I tried to avoid that with this poem, and I tried to go a different way and make it circular in nature, so that all of the rhyme in the end led back to the rhyme in the beginning, as opposed to, you know, the arrow of poetry that's aimed to kill. And that's where I'm at now. I think I've got a couple more slides.
Okay, it's just so you know, it's 9:40.
Okay.
And the next one begins at 9:50.
Okay.
So you can wind yourself down in the next 5 minutes.
Okay, good deal. So where do I proceed from here? I don't really know. Again, there's really no reason to continue down like the path of despair and like ugliness. I think we have like plenty of that in our life. You know, so the word for this that I came to, like, while I was like, you know, really trying to make sense of all this, is Weltschmerz, which is the German word, which means that your reality will never equal your expectation of reality. And that is what I left in my 20s, and a lot of it has to do with becoming reflective of poetry, that all of the shortcomings of reality, oh yeah, they're there, but there's really no need to be like nihilistic about it, right? Because there's a dawn at the end of all of those dark nights. And I think we live in a time of very deep nihilism in Weltschmerz. And when we have like the most popular television show in the history of time is like, you know, zombies like walking around, like making us all like these mindless consumers. when do we come out of that nihilism, and how do we come out of it? And so I have Shakespeare, so I have one more. I did a shout out to Shakespeare, so I got to do a shout out to Preston, to Emily. So I have to end with hope, because it's a thing of feathers. And this down here is a horse, the Elasporiuric horse. There we go. So, there we go. And Emily and Shakespeare. Got them all in. Got them all in. Yeah. Thank you. Wow. Yeah. So, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ellen. Thank you, Preston College. Changed my life. As ridiculous as it is.
So